Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Teen in Action Forum. Joined by myself, Alana, and I will be your host and facilitator for today's session. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you as we're going to explore some exciting topics in technology, idea, innovation. Today's particular session will be on AI in climate action. For those who may be new to us, Teens in AI is a multi-award winning social impact initiative that was launched at the United Nations AI for Good Summit back in 2018. Our mission is simple: to empower the next generation of AI leaders and innovators. Over the years, we've reached more than 20,000 young people across over 250 cities in 97 countries, truly making a global impact. And we hope to reach even more. Today's session is in partnership with Sage, an organization that is committed to inspiring a new era of AI leadership. And together, we're paving the way for more young people to make a difference in AI. But before we get started, I have some more news. At the end of the workshop, in today's session, we'll be sharing some more information and special discounts on our latest courses, programs, and events. So if you're passionate about AI and you want to take your skills to the next level, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. We'll share all the details at the end, so stay tuned. And now let's get into today's session. So for today's session, you'll get a chance to learn a little bit more about the climate crisis and climate science, and how Sage Earth is using AI categorization to help smaller businesses, and why this is important for carbon footprint tracking. You will also participate in a workshop, which is a challenge of how AI systems can improve categorizing fuels for carbon tracking. And of course, at the end of the session, you'll be sharing your thoughts, questions, and your feedback. So before we dive in, here's just a little bit of notes of how we're going to collaborate today. And that is to keep an open mind and be curious. Don't hesitate to share your ideas. This is a judgment-free zone. To please respect everyone's opinions and to keep our discussions positive and constructive. You may all use the chat feature to share your thoughts, and also please let us know where you're joining from. Can't wait to see more. And lastly, to make sure that we wrap up on time. So I'm going to now introduce our speakers for today, which is Graham and Natalia from Sage. On the left, we have Graham, who is a product manager at Sage Earth with over 10 years of experience in business software. He's specialized in conversation intelligence tools at companies like Refract and Allegro before joining Sage Earth in 2023. And we see they've now joined us on screen. Since then, he's played a key role in launching the Carbon Measurement API and also user-facing carbon accounting products. And outside of work, he lives in Newcastle, which is based in the UK, Newcastle upon Tyne, with his wife and 2 cats. Natalia, on the right, is a climate scientist at Sage Earth with over 15 years of experience in environmental research, policy, and sustainability consulting. She works making carbon data meaningful for businesses. Outside of work, though, Natalia is passionate about tango dancing, creating educational games, and exploring the connections between nature and human systems, both scientifically and emotionally. Now, let's give a warm welcome to Graham and Natalia, and let us begin. May you use your emojis again, and also say hello to us using the chat feature. Now I will hand over to Graham and Natalie. You may feel free to share your screens and get started.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here. I will hand over to Natalia for the first section. I'm just going to set up my screen share here.
No problem.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Graham. Pleasure being here. And it's an exciting topic for me. It's not an easy topic for anyone, especially today as we assist to ever new records, record high temperatures, record frequency of floods, and so on. It's not an easy topic, but it is a very important one. And most importantly, it is a very meaningful one to engage with and to start thinking about when we think of how could we use tech for good. This is a very good cause to get engaged in. So to try to zoom out and get the big picture, right? Like, why are we talking about climate crisis? Why is it a climate crisis? And what's the difference between a climate crisis and climate change, right? So it's a climate crisis because it's not just one issue that we're looking at. It's very tempting to think of climate change in terms of the emissions that we're generating, the carbon footprint, but it's not just that. The climate crisis is part of a larger system breakdown, what we have been conceptualizing for a few years now as planetary boundaries. These visuals here on this slide show us these planetary boundaries, a conceptual way of looking at the health of our planet. And think of it as Earth's critical life support system, but not for the Earth itself, but for us as a society, right? So when we cross these boundaries, when we go beyond this safe operating space, which we see in green color, the planet becomes less stable, less predictable, less suitable for our lifestyle as we have come to enjoy it as a society. And it's not really about saving the planet. Climate action is not about saving the planet. It is about keeping the Earth livable for us as humans and for the nature as it is and as it is supposed to support our economy, our way of living, our comforts, and so on. So climate has changed before. Our planet is more than 4.5 billion years, right? We have had hotter climate on this planet millions of years ago. The big difference and why it's a problem now is that human beings, and especially the developed human society as we are now, we have not witnessed such a climate before. We have not lived in such an unstable climate before. So this is a very new experience for us as a society. We have never dealt with so much unpredictability before. And what is also different now is that the speed of change in the climate is increased because of the inputs that we as human beings through our economies have, the emissions that we're generating. And in the way that we are acting in relation to our planet, we're disrupting multiple boundaries at once. The more boundaries we cross, the more these risks amplify each other. So climate change, which is one boundary we're crossing, right, can trigger things like biodiversity loss, increased water stress. Then when we talk about water stress, we think about the impact on our food security. So these different boundaries, they're not really isolated. They're interconnected tipping points, and climate change is one big issue that we as society have been contributing to massively. Graham, the next slide, please. Now, imagine Earth's atmosphere as a bathtub, right? The emissions that we're generating, partly emissions that are being generated through natural processes, but also they are the tap. They are what puts the greenhouse gas emissions out there. And these things are things like burning fossil fuels, deforestation, extensive agriculture and farming and so on. So these are the tap. Then we have the carbon removals that act as a drain for these greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, primarily for carbon dioxide. And the removals are things like trees, right? We all know about trees, but also the ocean uptake, so the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the ocean, or the fixation of carbon in the soil. These are the things that help us remove the greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. Now, what is a problem? The big problem, and what leads to this overshooting of the planetary boundary, is that the tap is gushing and the drain is quite clogged and is getting more and more clogged. So greenhouse gases keep building up in the atmosphere and they hit the planet unevenly, creating a disturbance in the weather patterns and predictability of the weather system on which our agriculture and many other functions depend, right? So This simple image explains quite a complex issue. More emissions means higher greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, means a hotter and more unstable climate system. Next slide, please. Now, our mission as a society at this point in time is to reduce these emissions from the atmosphere and from the way that we're generating them, and build resilience to the impacts that we're already feeling from the atmosphere already being quite heat up, right? As the top fills, these risks, they tend to spill over, right? Things like heat waves, floods, fires, food shocks, increasing food prices. Climate impacts are not linear. The more greenhouse gas emissions we have in the atmosphere, in the bathtub, the more extreme and unpredictable weather events we are going to have. And then these physical events, these weather events, link to other major societal events and social events. So what we need to do is we need 3 moves. First one is to close the tap. Well, maybe not close, but definitely reduce the volume, right? AKA, we need to reduce emissions. But we cannot reduce and we cannot manage what we cannot measure. The second thing is that we need to widen the drain, so to increase removals, to help the nature absorb the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and fixate them back into the soil, into the ocean, into the trees. And we need to strengthen the top in a way. So we need to build the resilience of our society to these impacts that are already happening. So again, this is not about saving the planet. The Earth will go on quite well, as it has been for more than 4.5 billion years. But our well-being as human beings, as a society, our economies, and our futures, the way we know how to live, depend on making these moves now, especially for the most vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. The big challenge around measuring and acting is that there are loads and loads and loads of data that we have been challenged to process at the same time. And whether we talk about reducing emissions or mitigating climate change, or we talk about adaptation, resilience building, increasing the capacity of our ecosystem to absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere, these require the processing of huge amounts of data to be able to act quickly. And what we have started to do for a while now, and especially with advance with the AI, it has gotten easier now, is to actually process this huge amount of data so we can act quicker. So it saves us time and money and other resources. And on this slide, we have 4 simple examples just to give you an idea of where the thinking around how AI could be used is at this point. So AI helps us deal with this climate complexity on many levels. Spotting patterns, so processing loads of data, right, to spot patterns, to predict change, or at least forecast, and to support faster decisions. One example, the first one, is around mapping the impact of deforestation. So there is a company, Space Intelligence, in the UK that uses satellite data to map deforestation. As we've seen, deforestation is a problem because it generates emissions and because it reduces the capacity of Earth to absorb emissions. AI is used to process high-resolution forest imagery, which is quite a complex issue and many, many data points, right? It helps expedite this process. Another company, Supremo in Brazil, it predicts extreme weather so that communities can be better equipped to face the impacts. So it helps with the resilience building and adaptation to climate change. The AI in this case is used to analyze risk scenarios from real-time climate data. So volume and speed. Google DeepMind, you may have heard about these ones, right? They work on many things. One of these things is to forecast wind power supply so that more renewable energy can be introduced in our electricity generation. AI, in this case, learns from historical weather data and turbine outputs to be able to inform the extent to which the turbines could be used to generate wind and then to influence the consumption and the grid dynamics, the electrical grid dynamics. And the last but not least is a very interesting use case of AI in processing large amounts of data when it comes to legal documents, standards, and regulations. So Climate Policy Radar in the UK helps policymakers navigate laws because we have large amounts of text, large amount of documents. Sometimes it's quite challenging to keep the grip on what's happening. So this company uses AI to scan and organize these thousands of legal texts and inform quick decision-making and better decision-making. So when we look at AI, it's not really AI replacing the work of people or what we're doing, but it's more helping us, it's giving us smarter tools essentially to act faster, better, and at a larger scale with better data. In our case, let's go to the next slide, please, Graham. In our case, we're focusing particularly on small and medium businesses in Sage Earth to work to help measure greenhouse gas emissions and then act on reducing them. Now, you may wonder, why SMBs, why this focus on SMBs? And the answer is quite simple and straightforward. So on the one hand, small businesses, they may be small, medium, but they have a big impact. So the SMBs generate up to around 60% of global emissions from the business sector. Often, these go unnoticed because of the size of the businesses, but in an aggregate mode, it's quite a big impact. When we talk about climate policy and tech, where tech could be used and how climate policy could be applied. So we need to tackle these cohorts, so to speak, of entities, the small, medium businesses, in large numbers, and they also need to act. But most SMBs, although they may want to act, they're quite limited in the time that they have available, in the tools, in expertise, and frankly speaking, in money, because it's not easy and it's not cheap to measure carbon footprint and to reduce the carbon footprint using our traditional ways, right, without the help of AI or some sort of an automation. So many businesses, many small and medium businesses, they are really focused on staying afloat rather than, calculating their greenhouse gas emissions and acting upon that. And that's where we as Sage and particularly the Sage Earth project comes in. We use the software to make carbon footprinting simple, quick, easy, and still accurate, and most importantly, useful for both the small and medium businesses and for the real economy, right? So while many other tools and many companies are focused on supporting larger corporations, and rightfully so, they are big emitters, we're trying to address a wider number of businesses that are smaller so that we have an impact at scale. Now, Graham, and I'll hand over to him. He will give you more details on how we're doing that. And and probably then give you a bit of a taste of what AI is doing in our carbon accounting.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalia. Yeah, so for the next section of the talk here, I'm going to be walking through how we use AI in a real-world product. The purpose of the model that we use is to automatically categorize business spends, and we do that with the end result of using detail about those spends to estimate the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that come from those spends. We're going to walk through, I'm going to give some detail about how we do this, why we do this, and the considerations that we have to make when we're interacting with the end user here. And then we'll have some time to take general questions. So if anyone does have questions from anything that Natalia's just gone over or anything I go over in this section, then drop them into the chat and we'll be able to wrap those up after this section. So yeah, the model that we use, as I say, uses AI to categorize the spends that a business makes. Our software solution automatically imports those spends, assigns a suggestion of what the category of that spend should be, and then we interact with the end user to make sure that's right, and that ultimately the output of that whole process is that we calculate the emission associated with that spend, and that gets rolled up into a carbon footprint. So when we're thinking about estimating or measuring carbon emissions, there are a couple of ways of doing this. What we're going to be talking about today is what's referred to as a spend-based methodology. Now, if we want to estimate the emissions of a business, we need to understand things about the activities that that business conducts. When I talk about activities, most things that a business does produce an emission of greenhouse gas of some kind. So, for example, if a business is consuming energy to power computers or lights or heating in the building, there are emissions associated with that. If a business is delivering physical goods from one location to another, there are emissions associated with that. And we need to understand enough about the activity in order to pass that through our methodology and understand what the emission is of that, so that that can be rolled up into a carbon footprint. And from there comes the understanding. And as Natalia mentioned, once we understand, or once the business understands where the emissions have come from, that gives them a sensible starting point to take actions to reduce those emissions. So the goal of our system is to provide an estimated upstream carbon footprint based on what the software knows about the activities a business conducts. And our methodology states that we can estimate an emission if we understand either what the business did, which we refer to as a usage, or what the business spent money on, which we refer to as a spend. So an example of a usage, as I say, if a business is consuming electricity energy to power their buildings, that's measured in kilowatt hours. Or if we're talking about transportation of goods, that's measured in a distance metric like kilometers. With a spend, we could be talking about a purchase of goods from a supplier. So if my business is a physical retail location, I'm buying in, could be timber for construction, or it could be food or whatever. There are emissions associated with the production and the transportation of that material to my business. And similarly, also, some of these activities we can have multiple data points from different sources for. So electricity energy usage, I mentioned that we can measure in kilowatt hours. We can also measure that in pounds spent. So the spend-based methodology says that if we understand what the business has spent money on, we can use that spend as a proxy to still understand what the usage was. Many activities can be represented by either. If, though, we automatically process a business's spends by ingesting those from their financial accounts platform, using AI to automatically assign a category which is good enough that we can calculate the emission from it, we can actually estimate most of a business's carbon footprint automatically without the end user having to do anything. And that's a really big selling point for a software platform like Sage Earth. So we have this AI model that tries to assign categories to financial spends. Why is that important? Well, the category of a spend determines what we refer to as the emissions intensity factor, or forgive the jargon, I'm going to forget and just refer to it as an EIF. That's used in the calculation. The EIF is the conversion factor. So diesel used in vehicle fuels, that has an EIF conversion factor, and it says that for every £1 you spend on diesel for vehicle fuels, the emission for that is so many kilograms of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And for every £1 you spend on bananas, the emission is different. A different EIF is used. So the category of the spend, diesel or food, that's what determines which EIF is used, and that determines the output of the emission that's used in the carbon footprint. Our taxonomy of categories has around 750 entries, and it's also hierarchical. At level 1, we have very generic categories like purchase of food. And at level 3, we might have a more specific category like purchase of dairy products. The more generic categories use a more generic EIF with more averages, and the more specific categories use a more specific EIF, which means we end up with an emissions estimate that's closer to what the real world emission from that activity is. So one goal that we have in this whole process is to use as specific a category as we can. That's the end result. If there's data that says this is a more specific use, we will use that because that ends up with a better estimate of what the emission actually was. I mentioned we use an AI model for this, and there's a few reasons for this. One is to do with volume. Businesses have lots of financial transactions. The small businesses that we see can have several thousand financial transactions within a single year. getting up to the medium side, and Sage does specialize in software for small and medium businesses. A medium business in the UK may have tens of thousands of financial transactions per year. It's a really repetitive task to ask an end user to check and apply the categories to those by hand. So if we involve AI in the loop there and have the AI make some suggestions, we can reduce the burden on the end user, and that's really valuable to users because in small and medium businesses, time is money. The spends are also a good fit for this because they have a fairly consistent data structure, and we're asking the AI model to apply categories from the taxonomy, which is a defined set. We're not asking an AI, give your best description of what this spend is in whatever words you see fit. We're saying, of these around about 750 categories, which one best fits this spend, and this spend. And it's also a good fit for AI because we had the training data to be able to build and train the model in the first place. Earlier versions of our system, all categorization was manual, so we had around about 100,000 transactions available in order to feed in to train the model to be able to make these AI predictions. Here's a very simplified view of what the data flow looks like. The business conducts an activity. So let's say, for example, that's an employee who's driving a van to deliver orders to customers. And there's a real world emission that greenhouse gas is emitted when that activity happens. That activity needs to be represented in the business's footprint. Now, there's almost always a record of this sort of thing. Businesses quite often have strong incentives to keep records for things. There could be an operational benefit to the business tracking some things they do. Quite often there's legislation that says if your business conducts this type of activity, you have to keep this type of record. And with our methodology supporting spend-based as well, this includes whenever a business spends money or receives money, they need a record of that in the business's financial accounts. And those tend to be fairly accurate and a fairly good representation that cover most things the business actually spends or receives money on in real life. So that means they're a good source of data for us. So the data that represents the activity is taken as an input into a carbon measurement methodology, and this produces an estimate of the emission. Roll up many emissions over a period, and that's what a carbon footprint is. Within our system, we take that calculation methodology and we represent it in software. It requires some specific inputs to enable it to understand when did the activity happen, what was the activity, and how much of it did the business do. And given those inputs describing a single activity, it then outputs an estimate of the emission, which you can see on the right-hand side of this screen. Over on the left here, this green box that says transaction details, that's the data that we have to work with when we're using spends. The date of the spend answers the when did it happen question, and the amount and currency of the spend answers the how much of it happened question. But we still have to describe the what was it about the activity, and that's what we mean when we talk about the category. Inputs that describe the type of spend from an accounts platform are a transaction description, the supplier name, and the nominal code. If you're not familiar with a nominal code, that's a sort of category or grouping that happens in financial accounting, but it doesn't map very well to our categories for carbon accounting. But we do have those fields to lean on. And if you read those fields for some transactions, you would come away with a reasonable understanding of what the activity was. And that's what our AI model does. For the AI model itself, its sole purpose is to categorize transactions. So we only send it the data points that are relevant to suggesting the category. So here's an example of the sort of behavior we would expect to see from the model. If we give it the inputs on the left there, so the nominal code of the financial spend is materials, the supplier name is B&Q, which for anyone outside of the UK, that's a common kind of hardware store in the UK. And there's a transaction description there. So looking at those three data points, I as a human can make a reasonable prediction and say, yes, this business was buying construction materials of wood. And the AI model hopefully should match that as well. I mentioned that the taxonomy is hierarchical with more generic and more specific categories. So we actually have three models working in tandem here, each of them specialized and trained to make a suggestion at each level of the taxonomy. That's not super important, but this is the general real world detail of how this works. Each model suggests, when given these inputs, it suggests a category and it also returns a confidence value. And we reject the suggestions if they're below a confidence threshold. So in a real world example with these inputs, materials B&Q 6x untreated pine, then we may get a level 1 suggestion of construction materials with really high confidence. We get a level 2 suggestion, timber for construction, with fairly high confidence. And then we get a level 3 suggestion. The level 3 categories are sometimes a little bit into the weeds because they actually refer to the production mechanism as well as what the thing is. In this case, it's not confident enough, so that's rejected. So the overall AI suggestion for this thing is the AI model is saying, I think this was a purchase good. I think it was a purchase of construction materials and specifically timber for construction. So that's what we would use and serve up to the end user. Now, AI models are imperfect and AI is complex, and end users sometimes misunderstand what AI is doing. So over the last few years, one thing that's been a real focus for us at Sage across many products which have AI facilities within them is how do we actually design the user experience around that? And Sage has developed some best practices for this, which are largely based on observations of user interactions with our products and user research and that sort of thing. With our categorization flow in Sage Earth, we use this splash screen to introduce the overall flow and help users understand the concepts of categorization, and we show this the first time the user lands within this screen. We pay a lot of attention to the language that we're using in screens like this. We use behavioral science principles throughout to try and get the best result for the end user and from the end user. So in this case, you can see an example of the principle of reciprocity, which states that when a provider of a solution goes to a user of that solution and says, here's what my solution did for you, now here's what we want from you, we get better results than just saying to the end user, here's what we want from you. One of those principles that Sage has developed through this user research is that users find it really important to understand what action was taken by AI versus what action was taken by a human end user. So we use these visual indicators to show when the suggested category has come from AI, or we don't show those if the suggestion has come from the end user. I mentioned that the AI's predictions are imperfect, and it's important to acknowledge this. We know sometimes it will make bad suggestions, so it's really important that we allow the user the capability to edit the category. We encourage users to edit where the suggestions are wrong and apply a different category which more closely describes the actual real-world transaction. And we encourage the end user to confirm the AI suggestion when it's right, and we take both of those as feedback learning events that we feed back into the model so that over time it will iterate and do a better job given similar types of descriptions for similar types of transactions in future. As well as the suggestions being important, it's also really key to recognize that the end user often has context about what the spend actually was in the real world that the system can't know, because all we have to work with are the fields that we have, like the description and the supplier name. So we always trust the end user's edits, the end user's suggested category, over what the system suggests. We always take that in good faith and assume the user knows what they're doing and knows something that we don't. Even if they suggest a category that doesn't really line up with what we might expect given the transaction description, we trust that the end user has context that the system doesn't. So their edits are always the ones that are actually applied. We do have some challenges with this. It's not perfect. Few things in real life and real software ever are. In this case, some of the challenges that are worth calling out is we have reasonable volume of training data, but that was sourced from a relatively small pool of around 100 businesses that had used our solution up until that time. So that means that there are gaps and biases in that training data. The model I'm talking about here, we have an earlier version of it in our software that's in production today, but I've actually mostly been talking about a version that hasn't gone live yet. We're about to have a really big release in the next couple of months. So while we've done some internal testing, we know there's still potential here that the model might make some bad suggestions. Hopefully, encouraging users to edit bad suggestions and to confirm good suggestions will help to mitigate that. And another big challenge that we have here is the quality of the data that we see in the fields that we rely on varies quite a lot. I was involved in an exercise to produce some data to help QA this model to quality assure it while it was in development last year. And a group of us took around 10,000 spends, which the model hadn't been trained on. And we compared the model's suggested category of that with our own suggested category, and we did that as a blind test. And what we found is there's a reasonable chunk of transactions that actually, even with the nominal code, the description, and the supplier name, as a human looking at that, if you don't have other context about what the transaction was, you can't really make a good suggestion. So we know that quality of data is really a factor in how good the prediction of the category is. unfortunately, end users still want the model to perform well, so we can't entirely just say it's garbage in, garbage out. We do still have to make best efforts with this because users are relying on this as a tool. I'm going to pause here, and I think now's a good time for us to take some questions. Once we've exhausted those, or when we're ready to move on, we do have a challenge that we want to try and workshop with the group. But yeah, let me pause here and throw to Alana to see if we do have any questions.
Amazing. Thank you for the talk so far. It's been really, really interesting. So we do have a few questions that have come through in the chat. Thank you to everyone. The first is from Isa, and this is, how do you link spend, i.e. spending on fuel, to carbon emissions? Example, there are other variables such as efficiency of the fuel or the engine.
Do you want to take that one, Natalia? That's kind of a methodology question.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So first of all, we do use spend, but spend is a very first entry point before getting more accurate data. And we always encourage the users to get more and more accurate data. So for example, if they first enter that they've spent £100 on fuel and they know that it likely has been diesel, we then encourage, okay, we give an estimate, but to actually have a more accurate footprint, in the next iteration, maybe next quarter or next year, try to give us, the fuel and the type of fuel in liters or in gallons or some other unit, right? That's the first thing. So spend is an intermediary data point for estimating the footprint. Now, when we do have the spend and we know that it's likely a diesel or aviation fuel or a different type of fuel, right? Generally speaking, these types of fuel, they have similar properties. So we know that 1 liter of diesel is likely going to have the same emissions, whether it's in the UK or in the US or somewhere else. What is different, though, is the price of fuel. So in UK, what we do, for example, is we use the average price for different types of fuel. So based on the spend, and looking at the average price for that particular fuel in that country, we estimate the volume that has been consumed, and then we apply the emission factor to that volume, right? Hence, why we encourage that in the next iteration, the user actually gives us the volume rather than just the spend. But based on spend and based on certain economic parameters like price, consumption, inflation, and other, we can reasonably estimate the actual volume of fuel or other types of materials.
Amazing, thank you. And we have a second question from Yabuz. How do they suggest, based on the different materials, is it based on the cost, the GHG emission, or the impact of the climate? That's a good segue from the first one.
So the categories that are suggested is based purely, we have this existing taxonomy, which covers, as I say, around 750 entries, and that gives reasonable coverage of all of the activities that we reasonably expect a business would do, or certainly spend money on anyway. And the AI model is purely doing this based on those descriptors of what the spend is here. So things like the supplier name and the transaction description. It's taking those as inputs and saying, okay, given a spend like £100 at, if the supplier name is ESSO and the transaction description is fuel, the model would be expected to make a reasonable assumption that that's a purchase of fuel for a vehicle. So it would assign that category to it. It's not biased towards what the emission is. We don't tell it to try and suggest, categories with a particularly high or particularly low footprint value, or it's not biased in any way other than it was trained on users applying these categories to similar transactions. Hopefully that answers the question okay.
Next question that we have is, can your app allow SMEs to interact with the carbon financing market, and have to track their footprint in other countries apart from feeling like they're being eco-responsible?
Yeah, so in terms of interacting with the carbon financing market, we do have an API solution as well as the user-facing product that I've been talking about here today that API product, we're seeing quite a lot of interest from banks and those in the financial services sector here, because that industry is doing a fairly good job of kind of self-regulating and making sure that it's taking measurements seriously. And one of the ways it incentivizes businesses by giving them access, for example, to green finance if they have measured their emissions. So in that sense, yes, for our interaction with the direct end user, we focus on measurement today. There is a whole kind of cohesive carbon reduction journey, of which one part is interacting with carbon markets both to secure green finance if you need to make changes to your business. And then at the very end of the journey, when you've done everything in terms of measuring reduction and that side of things, the last few percent of this is offsetting, which I think maybe this question about carbon markets, that's not something that we interact with really today, but is potentially something that we'll explore in the future. I'm sure, Natalia, because I mentioned offsetting, you may want to weigh in on that side of things as well, because this is commonly misunderstood, right?
Yeah, I mean, the short version is that right now you cannot buy or sell carbon credits on our tool. It's not designed for that at this point. There is a wider conversation around the carbon offsets anyway, which probably is a subject for a different conversation. However, to fill in a little bit the response on the incentives, there is a finance market that, when they're financing small and medium businesses, whether it's banks or other institutions, they do have a direct incentive because they need to increase the share of their green loans, and therefore they're interested in asking businesses to measure their footprint so that they know that by investing in green transition, the footprint is actually lowered. But there is an even more immediate incentive, because not all small and medium businesses take loans from the financial markets. The more immediate pressure is usually from the customers of the small and medium businesses. Because many of the small and medium businesses, they are serving larger businesses or governments. And then this is a sort of a cascading demand. As bigger businesses and as governments take action to decarbonize and to reduce their footprint, they cannot reduce their own footprint if their supply chain, which includes these small medium businesses, do not do their part, right? So if I purchase transportation services, Uber, Bolt, right? If I purchase this from my supplier, it is up to my supplier to switch from diesel cars to electric cars. So unless my supplier does that, I cannot reduce my footprint from business travel. There is a very strong connection, and this is one of the strongest incentives for small and medium businesses. A third one, and I'll stop here, is coming up, and that is usually the insurance. Insurance companies, they are the first ones, they're really at the forefront of losing money when it comes to claims from climate impacts like floods and so on. And therefore, to mitigate these risks, what they tend to do is to increase the premiums that they ask from the businesses, for example, if they have exposed assets, right? So what happens is that as businesses become more aware of their own risks, including how much they're contributing to climate change through the emissions, the more aware they become, the more likely they are to take action, and this will then drive the insurance premium down. So there is an incentive also to pay cheaper insurance on the long term if they take action now.
Absolutely. There's one more question from Mariam Alaka. How can AI traffic systems be designed to cut urban pollution? I'm keen to hear your view because in my A-level geography fieldwork, I've been taking pollution readings in Barnet and King's Cross, and I'm really interested in how AI could make a difference.
I don't have any knowledge to speak to that. Maybe, Natalia, you've come across something in your research?
It is very often around efficiency of drive. The driver behavior influences a lot the amount of fuel that the car consumes, right? So if the driving is more aggressive, with many brakes and many accelerations, it's going to consume more fuel, it's going to burn more fuel, right? So implementing an AI-based solution that can, say, autonomous cars or correct a little bit of this erratic behavior of the drivers, it can reduce in very immediate terms, it can reduce the amount of fuel consumed through this behavior, driver behavior. But then I think this is a very, very good question for further ideation, because there are many challenges and many problems that contribute to the traffic pollution. And each of these individually can be addressed because each of these require a deep dive into the causes and the type of data needed to be processed to then inform decision. And I will actually throw the ball back at you and say, oh, so what do you know to be the problems? And how, if you drill down, how could what sort of data we need to resolve that problem, and how could AI be used there? But yeah, one example is this, the correction of driver behavior to reduce fuel consumption.
And that's a fantastic idea. So we'll have one more question here. This is from Shakib from Tunisia. How could teens use AI to promote sustainable habits, such as reducing waste or conserving energy in schools or in their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. Again, not something I would feel very qualified to speak to here. Certainly, in terms of what Sage are doing with this, our focus is on businesses and the SMB market specifically for the reasons that Natalia outlined. But there are definitely solutions right across. One thing to kind of highlight and make everyone aware of is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of software solutions out there that are in the ESG or carbon measurement space, and some of those are targeted at individuals. So I'd say if that's something you're interested in, if you research, you are very likely to come across someone who is thinking or exploring in that same space. Natalia, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm just thinking of specific examples of related to food waste, for example. There are apps, and there is right, when we think of AI, we think of processing a lot of data. And when it comes to behavior, it is processing a lot of behavior data, right? So if you can input data around your consumption, around, how much you buy, how much you throw, then it can learn that you tend to, forget about some of the items you buy, and then you end up throwing that. So it can come in and trigger some notifications around, hey, that piece of bread is going to expire soon. I want to prepare it somewhere, consume it in one way, right? So this is one concrete example for individual behavior. When we look at the businesses and businesses that process larger amounts of food, it's a different conversation there, right? It's around how the food is being stored, what parameters are ideal for different types of food items to keep and to prolong the life and so on. But generally speaking, I'm looking at reducing waste and conserving, I think it's this one, right? Reducing waste and conserving energy. In terms of conserving energy, there is a very, very big effort across the world around understanding consumer behavior when it comes to energy consumption, so that at this point, when we generate electricity from wind or from solar power, it's intermittent, it's not constant and continuous. So to be able to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix, we need to understand when consumers use most energy, so we can use more of the solar and wind power, and when the consumption is less, so we can kind of compensate with other sources like nuclear or still fossil fuel to make the balance there realistic. So AI is used to predict these consumption patterns and to suggest in real time when to turn on one tap or the other in terms of where the energy is being produced from. And there are many, many more. It's a wonderful question. I think you can even have a whole workshop just around this question.
Absolutely. And let's just take one more question from Joseph before we move on to the workshop. How can we as young people contribute the data needed for these AI models? For example, could we use our phones to collect environmental data? Some people might think using AI for climate harm, like finding more fossil fuels. So how do we prevent that?
Yeah, let me speak to the second part of the question first, because that's actually really pertinent. One thing that's important to recognize is, while we've talked about AI as a concept for decades at this point, the current wave, generative AIs, has really only been unlocked and is starting to be used in meaningful ways in the past really 2 years, 2.5 years or so. When an industry and technology is moving really fast like this, there are always risks. And I think one thing that's really important to be mindful of is that legislation, regulation around what AI can and can't be used for, what is responsible use of AI, that's likely to move much slower because legislation tends to move slower than technology. Speaking, as a representative of a large business here, one thing that we're really mindful of Sage is ethical use of AI, ethical use in everything we do with data, but specifically recognizing that this is a problem, and there are guidance that's given out to product teams like ourselves about what is and is not a good fit for for AI, what is and is not an appropriate way to process data. Now, the independent market's not necessarily going to self-regulate itself there. So yeah, that's a question with a really difficult answer, or maybe no answer yet here. What we as kind of participants in broader society need to do is be mindful, be vocal about this, and encourage and frankly demand that that governments and those making legislation are taking this stuff seriously, because as many wonderful uses as we can find for AI and ways that we can find to improve stuff, there will be definitely uses of it that are bad, are challenging. I expect this is something that maybe has come up in some of your other workshops as well, Alana, around ethical use of AI. So maybe there's maybe you have some thoughts on this as well.
Many thoughts. Really, the questions are wonderful. In terms of something actionable, because I always like to give something actionable, even if there are many things that are still discussable and debatable there. In terms of the actual contribution and agency for young people and teens to feel that they're doing something, I do encourage you to look for citizen science initiatives in your area. Citizen science initiatives have become much more widespread in the recent years, especially with the proliferation of different technology and smartphones and other modern technology. And there are many local initiatives in many, many countries that try to gauge this access to technology to produce pieces of research and inform policy making, inform decision making, inform different citizen initiatives like petitions and projects, local projects based on this citizen science, citizen supported research, where citizens are the ones that provide pieces of data that those groups then aggregate and base recommendations off of.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So with a few minutes left of our session, let's move on to the workshop. And then you can move on to the next slide. Great.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I lost you for a second there. So yeah, we'll do a very quick version of this because we only have a few minutes left. I mentioned we do have some challenges in the model as it sits today. And one of these comes around the data quality piece that I was speaking about. Sometimes, given the fields that we look at today, we don't have enough detail for the model to make an accurate prediction or to give a usable, actionable, good category for that spend. Vehicle fuel is a really good example. So that's the one that we're going to talk about today. About 1% of the spends we see by businesses are on vehicle fuel. But of these, way more than half don't actually contain enough detail to specify whether the fuel is petrol or diesel or another fuel like LPG or electricity is kind of a separate example here. But really, if the challenge is we have these kind of informations to work with, you can see in the lower right, this is an example of a real transaction that we saw ingested and processed by our system. Given those details, we understand well enough to understand that it is a purchase of fuel. The fact that it's coming from a supplier called a filling station suggests vehicle fuel. So I would feel fairly confident in that assertion, and probably so would our AI model. What it's not going to be able to do is assign the petrol category or the diesel category for this. And that's a challenge because those have different EIFs. They have different emission amounts. You get a different carbon emission from burning diesel versus burning petrol. So the less accurate emission is a problem. One problem that's also present here is that the end user has context that the system doesn't. So if an end user sees this and we've given it a generic category like unknown vehicle fuel, the end user may have context that we don't. Like in my business, I know our entire vehicle fleet is diesel, so this must be a purchase of diesel. So this is a challenge and something that I wanted to kind of hear if anyone does have any suggestions for. This is a real world challenge that we've not done a ton about yet, but we do have some ideas. Given an input like what we've got in the lower right here, does anyone have any suggestions for how our AI model could do a better job than suggesting unknown vehicle fuel and get an accurate read on whether that purchase of vehicle fuel is something more specific like petrol or diesel? I have some ideas. Maybe Natalia has some ideas as well, but we'd love to hear if anyone from the chat has a suggestion about what we should think about when we're considering a problem like this. Let me throw it to you, Natalia, while we're waiting for a response. You've seen this in action. You know, this is a real world problem, this distinction about not having enough data to assign an accurate category to something. Do you have any thoughts? Or if a suggestion was brought to you, if I came and said, hey, we have this idea about how we might improve the AI model, where would your mind go first? How would you make sure what I'm suggesting is valid from a climate science point of view?
Well, I would usually look at indeed how much data we have to inform the final decision. And it happens many times that it's just difficult for whatever reasons to make the best guess. The safest thing that we resort to then is the most conservative approach. And this is a very common thing in climate science, meaning if I know that there was some type of fuel consumed, but I don't know precisely what type of fuel, to be on the safe side and to make sure that we don't underestimate the footprint, but rather be on the overestimating side, we would go with assuming that that type of fuel is the one which is the most polluting, right? So then we would apply, if you want to calculate the emissions, we would apply in that case the emission factor for the most polluting diesel. And the thing, or the benefits here are twofold. On the one hand, indeed, we are more confident that we are not underestimating, meaning we are not suggesting that the business is greener than it actually is. And the second one is that the business may see that, oh, the footprint is very large. Now, why is it that large? So it would prompt them to, first of all, take action. So if the fuel, the carbon footprint from fuel consumption is so large, probably I need to consume less fuel, right? And buy less fuel, be more mindful of how I'm driving or what sort of cars or vehicles I'm using. And the second thing is that they may actually think, oh, but what? Oh, it's so big because it's actually based on the most conservative approach. So if I have better data, I have more data, if I'm able to provide more accurate data, then I also have a more accurate footprint. So this is incentivizing businesses to be more mindful of the quality of data and the way that they're recording their different business activities.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great point to take the most conservative approach and to overestimate rather than underestimating, given an absence of data. That is something that we do a lot. We have a suggestion from Asa in the chat as well here. We could determine the fuel based on the vehicle model. We could. We don't have that as a data point today. But if we think about, you know, that may be a real practical kind of actionable solution. Because if we think about the number of spends that we say, I say about 1% of spends of vehicle fuel, so that's a lot of granular transactions. If we ask the user to correct each of those transaction by transaction, that becomes laborious and tedious and the end user may not do it. But if we ask the user, do you have a vehicle fleet and what's that comprised of? Those are data points that are more likely to be static. They're still going to change over time, but that's something we could prompt a user for once a quarter to provide details. And we do this with some other areas of emissions. We ask users to update their count of employees and where the employees live once a quarter rather than doing that every single day so that we can calculate commuting emissions. So that's a really good suggestion, Asa. Cool. I think we are coming up to time here. Alana, did you have anything you wanted to close with?
Yes, I do. So thank you so much, everyone, for your suggestions. And if you do have any more ideas, please do keep them in the chat as we come through to the end of our session today. So from me, while we wait for Chi to start sharing again, just want to say thank you again so much, Graham and Talia, from joining us for today's session. It has really been super inspiring and also very, very interesting. especially considering the status of climate today and the technology that's moving forward with AI. It's been also really inspiring to see everyone's enthusiasm and also engagement, as we have seen how AI is transforming the climate crisis and also working with carbon footprinting. So I hope we've all been left with new ideas, insights, and motivation to dive deeper into the world of AI and innovation and also climate change. Before we wrap up, I have some amazing opportunities to share with you to continue your learning journey with Teens in AI. As a special thank you for being here today, we have a 20% discount on any of our paid courses, which you can use the code Teens in Action August at checkout. We also have new courses for you to learn about AI. If anyone is new is joining, we just hosted the AI for Good Incubator, which was a challenge, a bootcamp challenge to actually tackle where teams came together to prototype and develop AI solutions based on SDG goals. And that was based usually around climate as well. So that was really awesome. So if you missed out that last session, please do check out on our site to join that program for next year. But yes, we also have some new courses. We have courses on AI ethics, on data science. We even actually also have a climate change and AI free course on the platform. And we also have a math course that's also available for you to have a look at. So again, I just want to thank everyone for your energy and participation. If you are 16 and older and have joined us on the call, we also have a LinkedIn community that's available for alumni that will be sent out in an email that happens after the event. And also we share the rewatch on YouTube. So we really look forward to seeing on future events, workshops, and also in our global Teens in AI community. Until then, stay inspired, stay innovative, and have a wonderful day. Thank you again to Graham and Talia. I'm not sure if you have any final words to say before we close off.
No, just a thank you for having us. Thanks for engaging as well. Some of these questions have been absolutely fantastic, and it's great to see that people are thinking about this in such an amazing way. Yeah, wonderful. Natalia?
I love these questions more than I love my answers. And my only thing is just keep curious, keep trying to understand things, just follow your curiosity and follow your heart.
Absolutely. Thank you so much all.